So now the official welcome after the Pentecost break, and I discovered that I probably have copied the old slides and not the actual ones, but should work out well. So this is the wrong room number. I'm pretty sure I checked everything before I left for vacations, and then I copied the wrong slides. But since the heart does not change beating over the last 5 years, so we are on the safe side. So today, this is why I told that with the heart. Let's see to get that moving here. It's about sensors and cardiac pacemakers. So, and this means we have to take care of our heart. We have to check out what is a cardiac pacemaker. And why does somebody come to the idea that they might need sensors in cardiac pacemakers? Yeah, so that's the agenda for today. And that means in, let's say, blocks of this lecture, it's about anatomy and physiology of the heart, seen through the eyes of an engineer. We come to cardiac pacemakers. How do they work? What is their purpose? What is the idea behind that? And then it comes a little bit about control of the heart. And this brings us to the point that we might come to the conclusion that we need sensors to detect patient activity. And you all know that from your daily life. If you get out of bed, the heartbeat is, you're not up to speed immediately. At least I'm not up to speed if I get up early. So it takes me a while. If I'm running up and down the staircase, I feel my heartbeat going on very fast. If I'm afraid of something, close to an exam, or in my case, more talks with an audience of 1,000 persons, all experts, something like that, I'm still nervous and I feel my heart beating much faster than before. And if we now imagine that we would have an implant that replaces the heartbeat, that should be somehow adapting to that. Because if you have to run up the stairs to catch the train, you don't want to have a heartbeat of 40 per minute. That's probably not good enough. On the other hand, if you lie in bed and want to go to sleep, you don't want to have 160, right? Then we need something that adapts somehow, and the question will be, is this all activity driven, or can we also try to find a measure, a marker, whatever, to include the psychological load that we quite often have when we are afraid, when we fall in love, something like that, you know, that we feel our hearts beating faster. Can we adapt to that? So that's the broad storyline for today. I'm pretty sure that each and everybody of you has some ideas about the heart, about the anatomy and the physiology, and I'll try to give you an overview where I think it's important to keep an eye on that. And these slides, as you see, I did not update them, they're quite old, but the level on which we are now looking at the heart is not influenced by that. So I don't talk about the latest discoveries of subchains of whatever protein in an ion channel, but it's more about the general concept. So how do we come to that heartbeat stuff? What diseases might change that? How do we approach that? And what does it mean for the design of such a pacemaker? I think I don't have my favorite slide from overview talks here because this is far beyond, but I'll comment on that later. So the heart, if you talk to your whatever friend who's doing completely different stuff, or the grandparents or whatever, the heart for them is, I'm pretty sure, the pump, the motor who drives all the blood through the body. And looking a little bit more in detail there, we see two blood circuits there. And worldwide we can agree on that picture here, no matter where we come from, that we have the heart having left side and right side with the atrium and the ventricles, and from an engineering point of view we could say these are on one hand two pumps in series, so the atrium and the ventricle on one side pumping here the blood from the left side through the body circuit, which has a certain resistivity. And if you have a resistance and you want to push something through, you need a force. And this is like as an electrical engineer, I have to compare everything to electricity. You know, if you have a different background, you would do it differently. But in thermodynamics, for example, there's always that kind of analogy. If you have material parameters and you have a potential, that potential might be transferred into flow. That could be here either if we say this is an electrical voltage, an electrical current, and the material parameters are resistance or capacitance. Here we would have that pump, so it's more a fluidic system where we have the resistance of the blood vessels and the compliance. That means how much does the pressure change when I change the volume. Yeah, so like a watering hose in the garden, and if it's halfway broken, you see that there are some bubbles occurring somewhere if you put your thumb on the outlet, right? And I know a medical doctor would kill me for those statements, but I think it's good to mirror somehow the knowledge from daily activities and daily life a little bit, to get an idea what diseases could mean and what consequences we could have and how to tackle that. So this is one circuit, and then we have the right side of the heart, the right atrium, the right ventricle, pumping the blood through the pulmonary circuit. So we have again here in series pre-pump, main pump for that side. So that's in parallel. But all in all, that's a closed system. That means if we look from bird's eye perspective, right and left heart side are also in series. And that means if one side is overdoing or underdoing, it affects also the other side because of the closure of the system. The function, in very short, it's the supply of organs with oxygen, the transport of carbon dioxide, and the transport of metabolic agent. This is not topic of today. This is the purpose, but we want to focus on the heart. And looking a little bit into the anatomy, it gets tricky. So the heart is a muscle, and each and every muscle needs blood supply. So if we now have a system like the heart pumping blood to everywhere, how does the pump power itself? And this is done with the coronaries. This is the aorta. So the main artery going from the left side, from the left ventricle to the body. And shortly after the aorta leaves the heart, which we cannot see because it's seen here by the left pulmonary artery, there are those coronary blood vessels, the red ones having oxygen-rich blood, the blue ones carrying the carbon dioxide-rich blood, and these coronaries are placed all over the heart and deliver the blood supply to the heart muscle and thereby the oxygen. This is, for me, it's a really cool system because when the heart contracts, there's a kind of an overpressure, so pressure peak, and that pressure peak pushes the blood kind of backwards into the coronaries, that we always have a good blood supply there. And you can imagine if something is wrong here with the coronaries, the muscle does not get enough blood supply. So it's really thick and strong, and that means it's not enough that it just sees the blood by pumping it. So there's probably a diffusion of some hundreds of nanometers, or probably a micron, or 10 microns, but that's not thick enough. That's not enough to supply the whole heart muscle with oxygen. And therefore we need those coronaries that split up in several branches going, supplying certain parts of the heart with enough oxygen to maintain contraction and to survive. Right, and for me it's always have to get a step back and see what is now left and right and up and down, where are the ventricles and the arteries and the veins. This is from the other side, so let's call the back side of the heart, where you have the distribution of the blood vessels, the coronaries, on the back part of the heart. This is just for an overview. If you want to look into details, that you have it on the slides here. For me, and for us, probably more interesting is to make a cross-section and to look inside. What do we have? We have here both atria, so first stage pump, and the ventricles, second stage pump. They are separated from each other by the septum, so that there is no connection between those two sides. You might know that newborns still have an opening in there, so if they're connected to their mother's blood circuitry, that this circuitry exchanges everything, and by having them after birth, first breathtaking, there's a kind of pressure change in the pulmonary circuit, and this causes an overpressure, and this makes the flap flip to the septum, and if everything goes well, then this grows together. One disease is, for example, in newborns, that this septum does not close, and then you would not have separation of the body circuit and the pulmonary circuit. If you have a pump, you expect that the pump pumps in one direction and not back and forth and back without any preferential direction. To do that in the heart, we need a kind of valves that let the blood go into one direction and block it into the other direction. And these heart valves are the on one hand here, those flaps, the semilunar, and the other is hidden somewhere here. From the this is the artery, so it comes in and it goes into. Now I'm completely lost here. This goes there. This is in between the atrium and the ventricle, and if the ventricle contracts, it pushes those flaps backwards, and you have two flaps, and if they push backwards, they close. This is all passive. This is here kind of fibrous tissue. Fibrous tissue cannot contract by itself, so it's driven by passive forces. And those fibers here to the muscle wall of the ventricles are there to prevent the flaps to flow backwards. So it's just a kind of stopping mechanism. If you grow old, it can happen, or it happens, that the number of fibers is reduced, and that those valves, because they beat on average 80 times per minute, 24 hours a day, all your lifetime, that they do not close as good as in your youth. And that will mean there's a kind of backflow of blood, and that reduces the performance of the heart, and that is one of the reasons why older persons in many cases are not that strong as they have been in their youth. This is the second one here, from the ventricles to the blood, the cardiovascular system, so the vascular system, and it prevents a backflow here. And again, this is for directional output. If you have problems with your heart valves, there is replacement available, but this is not topic of today. So there are artificial heart valves on several stages, either purely mechanical, and I heard from persons that they can hear them. I would find that very annoying, and I try to sleep and I hear click, clack, on my heart, but better than dying, of course. Yeah, that is one of the good things with the heart. You know, we have 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 kidneys, 2 whatever. We have 1 heart, and if it fails, we're dead. And this makes decisions, and I don't mean that sarcastically. That's the truth. It helps to come to decisions. You know, if you have a close-to heart failure, and the question is, would you like a cardiac pacemaker or would you like to die? That is a quite simple decision. If your hearing gets worse or your sight gets worse, you know, then it's worse. Then you have still the other modality. So you can still listen if you do not see. You can still see if you do not listen. And that is more like a quality of life decision then. That ventilation and heartbeat is really vital. Yeah? And therefore, the cardiac pacemaker is such a success story. Yeah? In all other cases, you can discuss, is there an alternative? There is little alternative on a cardiac pacemaker. Yeah? Or a heart-lung machine. Yeah? Either your heart works and it's fine, or it doesn't work, then we are in serious trouble. So, having said that we have those valves, that is an important thing for later on today, and this is fibrous tissue. If you would take an electrical measurement equipment, you would find out that fibrous tissue is electrically insulating. And this is the whole plane here crossing the heart muscle between the atria and the ventricles, which is a kind of electrical insulating. That means whatever happens here does not automatically go there because of that dead end of insulation plane. And we have gazillions, I don't know how many thousands, heart cells. They need a coordinated contraction. Yeah? Otherwise, it's like a room with 10,000 persons who try to sing and there's no conductor, and they all sing together. That's an experience, but that's different from having a choir with a conductor who's singing a song, right? And this is here one of the challenges. Where's the conductor, and how does one conductor does all the coordination in a way that we don't have to think about that? I mean, none of us is thinking now my left ventricle should beat and then the right, and what about the atria, and what about the coordination? That would be a mess, right, if we would have to think about that. So there's a kind of autonomous system in the background, and that is what we have to take care of. As said already, this is here a different display of the coronaries. That's very important to keep in mind that we need those coronaries to deliver the blood to the whole muscle of the heart. And if you get a heart attack, you might have heard about that, myocardial infarction, the reason of that is that those coronaries are blocked. Mainly, there are some genetic prevalences, but it's mainly of a combination of not moving enough, of smoking, of fatty food and alcohol and smoking. And you know, whatever makes fun in some is the reason that there is calcification of the heart. If you be now very sporty and say, I'll train my whole life, you can have a too large heart and you can die by that. So there's always a good balance in between being not have not a healthy lifestyle and have a too healthy lifestyle. So, and it depends on a single person. So don't worry. If you worry your whole life, you might die earlier due to your worries. So, that means I have no good tools for you how to get a healthy and happy life. But if this is blocked, for example, then no oxygen can be delivered to that part of the heart, and if the heart muscle does not get blood supply for a certain period of time, then the cells die. And if those cells die, they cannot contribute to the contraction of the heart. And that means the output strength of the heart gets worse. You can get medication, you can get some stents. That's a kind of medical grade chicken fence that is placed inside those coronaries to keep them open or to widen them again. Also tricky stuff, very often done. One of the most done surgical interventions, minimal invasive, in patients suffering from mainly angina pectoris. That is a pre-stage of myocardial infarction, where you have a constriction of those coronaries, and by reduced blood flow you have similar symptoms. So you feel pain in the rib cage and in the chest and probably in your left arm. You get nervous, you have some stress then, and this can be done by medication, and if it takes too long, then you might get those stents, so implants made out of metal that widen those coronaries and keep them open. Also a different story, but just to give you an idea what else is already available for the heart. To cut that long story short, if the tissue is already dead, you cannot do anything. So cardiac pacemaker does not help after a myocardial infarction because the tissue is dead, and whatever is gone is gone. So there must be something else. So that's the veins. I jump over that.
Does the tissue regenerate itself after it stems?
No, unfortunately, no regeneration. There are some therapies where people try to have work towards progenitor cells, so derived stem cells in a way that they are already on their way towards cardiomyocytes, so heart muscle cells, to inject that, but I have no idea how far this is. There are options if you have a really fast therapy. So if you get a myocardial infarction and the tissue is on the way between hypoxia, that means too low oxygen supply, but not yet dead. There is hope and an option that it can recover, that you have only little loss and you can.
This is in terms of hours, or?
Minutes to hours. So the worst thing you can get is say, oh, it's Saturday afternoon, I go to the doctor on Monday morning. So it should be within hours. And this is always a good reason to call an ambulance, and not to go. There are regions in the world where people tend to be so brave that they pack their suitcase and go by foot to the hospital and say, hey, I feel pain in my chest, so might be something there. So it's in those cases it's really good reason to call that number, whatever it is, 911 in the States, 112 here. You had a question?
So yeah, I was asking if any symptoms were pain in the rib cage, is there also shortness of breath or something like that?
Could you? There's just a car.
Is there also shortness of breath in those cases, or is the only symptom pain in the rib cage?
It's pain in the rib cage, getting pain to the left arm, and it's need for breath, and there's a kind of panicking. So it comes also because of the too low blood oxygenation, you're panicking, and then it should be done by a medical doctor if it's mainly psychologically. It could be also that you just hyperventilate and they get similar symptoms, and then it's more psychological issue in that emergency situation. It could be that it could be cured by certain aerosols if it's that angina pectoris, so more vasoconstriction of the coronaries, and they're beautiful aerosols having TNT, that explosive in there, and you really kind of make a, that's my idea, I'm not good in chemistry, so but you know, kind of explosion, and that widens the coronaries. With the downside that your blood pressure drops about 40 millimeter mercury. So if you would have a heart attack and then the blood pressure drops again 40 millimeter mercury, this is something that should be definitely done under supervision in an emergency car or something like that. And of course, if you have a decent ECG, so recordings of the electrical signals of the heart, you can immediately see, if you're educated in that, in changes in the ECG, that part of the heart muscle does no longer contribute to the electrical signal, and can see that. But it's hard to have, let's say, one question and get the whole truth out of that.
Okay, thank you.
Already said, key is the coordination in the heart, and the coordination that is a kind of autonomous, we don't have to think about that, and that the heartbeat and the strength and the efficiency of the cardiac output is a kind of controlled then according to the need that we have. And this is in words of control theory, that's in hierarchical control. So we have multiple levels there. And the ground level is in the heart itself, in the right atrium, and now the yellowish things are the conduction system. So, and I come to the conduction system first, and then say some words about the single muscle cells that we have, the cardiomyocytes. So the idea is to get the atria contracted first, probably with a little delay in between one and the other, since we have two sides to control, and then the ventricles should contract in a way that the ratio of let's say, energy that I need and the output is best. And I have another stupid example for you. If you, now it's summertime and you might go to lake or to swimming pool, and if you swim and it happens that your towel falls into the water, then you have a wet towel. And the question is, how do you get your water out of that towel to make it less wet? And you could now try to squeeze it as fast as possible everywhere. That is one strategy, probably to train your fingers. But if you turn that, and I think wrenching is that word, and you twist it, then you are most efficient. And that is what the ventricles try to do. So they not only contract, but their muscle structure is such that they contract and they twist a little bit, which increases the output fraction. And if the opening is up there, it would be cool if they could start in a way that they squeeze the blood out from the apex here to those outlets. And therefore, we need a defined delay line and a defined distribution of the activity or the trigger signal. The good thing is all heart muscle cells are electrically active, and they are in an assembly that's called a syncytium. That means one cell, when it's active, can pass the activity to the neighboring muscle cells. That is something that doesn't work in our striated muscles of the arms or legs or ears or whatever we have, but just in the heart. But we need that superimposed triggering of that. And therefore, we have that sinoatrial node that gives trigger impulses autonomously from the brain, so no input needed. I think those experiments are now forbidden. When I did my studies and focus on biomedical engineering, I had to prepare a frog heart, and you could cut the frog heart out of the frog, and it was still beating for 2 hours. That means it was just the supply of oxygen and nutrients, and you could could investigate the nerve conduction, so the signal conduction system, and see how this interaction works on there. And we have this as primary pacemaker, the sinoatrial node in the right atrium. And since the muscle tissue is conductive and passes over the signal to the neighboring cells, the signal spreads from that sinoatrial node over the right atrium towards the left atrium. And then it dies out because of the insulating plane of the heart valves. But we have a trick. We have here the atrioventricular node passing over his bundle here, that plane of insulation, going into these branches here, which have no name in English and are called Tavara branches in German, to the Purkinje fibers, which go around the corner here in the heart. And that means activation starts at the end here and goes down to the apex in a way that it twists a little bit the heart and gets best cardiac output. We see two branches, one branch going to the left ventricle, another branch going to the right ventricle. Question is now, how does that work? A pattern generator and the distribution. I can already tell you that the nerves conduct the electrical signals faster than the muscles. Means they kind of override something, or they have the ability to override something. And we need a second ability, that there is not too much chatter in between different mechanisms. That means we would need a kind of refractory period when one cell is triggered and did its job, that it's silent for a certain period, not to interact with the mechanisms that are going on. Otherwise, we would have an activation back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. That's called heart fibrillation. But this is not a contracted output ejection that we would need. How does it work? If we would now play electrophysiologist for a minute or two, and we would record the signals, we see from the heart muscle cells that they have that resting potential, and if they get activated, we have, as you all know from action potential, whoop, the overshoot, and goes back to normal. What we see here, and we have unfortunately no scale on the x-axis, we have a kind of plateau here. And this plateau is about 100, 200, 300 milliseconds long. So that's quite a bit. It's not in the millisecond range of, or below a millisecond of nerve action potential, but it's really time that we have there, some hundreds of milliseconds. And this gives us a long refractory period of each and every cell after getting activated. If we would now have to describe what we see, we should describe that this resting potential is constant. That's what you know. When you have an action potential, tick, trigger, action potential, silence afterwards. If we now look on the actual pacemaker cells, we see something different. We see an action potential, goes back to the resting potential, and what we see is that we have two things: a maximum depolarization voltage here, well, this is, we call it like that, and we have, that's unfortunately German abbreviation here for langsame spontane Depolarisation, so slow spontaneous depolarization, which is a kind of leakage current. And that leakage current drives the potential to a threshold. As soon as the threshold is reached, you trigger the action potential. That means, with that mechanism of bit of leakage, you get a constant autonomous action potential, which is in the primary pacemaker in the right atrium. So now the question could be, how can I override that, right? If I want to be faster in running or more silence in meditation, so how can I do that? And there are two options. One is that you shift that maximum depolarization So if you would shift it to more negative values, it would take longer to reach the threshold. Or you can say I change the velocity and leakage. So if I have slower leakage rate, it would take longer to reach the threshold. If I would have faster leakage rate, it would go faster. And this is how let's say neurotransmitters and other control mechanisms could tap in here. So now we know what might be in the background. The question is, how can I see that? And I mean, if for me that's really amazing that people agreed that fast on a scheme how to record the ECG. Normally, you discuss for ages about something like that. You know, if we look on charging cables and connectors for mobile phones, 25 years, and we're close to 2, not to 1. So here we have been relatively close to one recording scheme. There are slight changes how to interpret that, and at the end we come up with 6 recordings from the frontal plane and another, depends how you count, up to 12 from the rib cage. But this is all the same worldwide, and that's a beauty, because that means we can record here in India, in Africa, in China, wherever, and we could send those data over the internet to whatever expert, and we can compare that. And that's so important that because if you, especially with all those digital opportunities that we have, I mean, it's easy to see if the heart is beating or not. I mean, one option could be you forgot to switch on the device, so always check easy things before you start reanimation, and that's one of the reasons why there's external automatic defibrillators that we also have here in case of a heart arrest. First check if the patient is probably just sleeping or completely drunk or whatever before they shoot 300 joules into that guy or girl. But we have those standard recordings that we use the arms and the left leg. There's also the option to use the right leg, but that's more sophisticated. That comes on Wednesdays with a biomedical instrumentation, the right leg. And if you say, well, I never got it and did not have to stand that way and got it on the arms, yeah, you can shrink that triangle down to the rib cage. Yeah, they say, okay, it's still a triangle here on my rib cage, and I place one electrode on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, and on the ribs here. That's good. For emergency reasons, it's good enough to have 2 points. To measure a voltage, so a potential difference, you need 2 points. So wherever you place something, you can see something, and this is then good enough. What we see, very important here, and I really mean that serious, one of the few things I'm really serious about, is we see the electrical activity of the heart with the ECG. We don't see the mechanical activity. We take it for granted that the mechanical activity comes with the electrical activity, right? Well, we should be a bit cautious there. Because if you would say, well, this is where the ventricles pump, yeah, it should be. There are rare cases, especially after reanimation, some stories from my first life as paramedic, there are rare cases where you have an electromechanical decoupling. That means the electrical activity of the muscle cells is still there, but they don't contract. And that's really a hard one, you know? That is one of the reasons why, if you remember, some of you might have undergone some first aid courses when they have a German driver's license. That is why you get told that you should check the heartbeat here on the coronary arteries. That's an easy one. If you feel that heartbeat, ba-boom, 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 then you know there is cardiac activity on the mechanical side. And therefore I kindly ask you not to tell me that this is contraction, what we see. This is electrical activity. that is linked to that, but there is a step in between, right? And what we have is the P wave, that is the activity of the atria, and the QRS complex, it's just the alphabet, yeah, P, Q, R, S, T. So QRS complex is the electrical activity of the ventricles, and the T wave is the repolarization of the ventricles. And for us today, it's enough to know that curve. To send us to that, this curve is a superposition of all the dipole vectors of each and every single heart cell in time and space, projected to the surface of the frontal plane of your body. This is where I would say 99% of all medical doctors are out. So you don't have to know in this concept, not all the details in the background. I just want to say it's more complex than it's shown here. And it helps us later on that complexity of many small, tiny little electrical components are changing over time, and we look at them from far and look at the superposition, what we get from the surface of our skin. That gives us an indication also to derive if something in the heart is going wrong.
I can't have one without the other. I can't have electrical, mechanical contraction without having electrical signal.
Right, but you can, it's only true in that direction. You cannot have mechanical contraction without electrical activity, but you can have electrical activity without contraction.
Mechanical.
And therefore we take it for granted in general that both comes together, but we should be careful with that.
So if you're reanimating people by having external contraction of the heart, by pushing it together, can you measure voltages?
No, because that is a good question. If you could measure voltages, if you contract the heart, but you contract the electrical activity comes by exchange of voltages on the cell membranes, and when you compress the heart, you just replace the mechanical function and not that ionic one. There are, and this goes far beyond your question, this is a kind of basic philosophy. Every 15, 20 years there comes that question about the egg and the chicken. So if you measure electrical activity at the nerve cell and you look very carefully with a microscope, you see that the cell membrane is moving a little bit. And then the question is, does the electrical voltage, the ionic exchange that causes the action potential, have the mechanical displacement as side effect? Or is it the mechanical displacement as such that has the action potential as side effect? I'm always off when it comes to those discussions because this goes really more into philosophy than into physics. And it's far from engineering. So it's not that you get something out of that really helps you. As my answer to your question, as I said, it's really on the macroscopic level, a pumping that does not influence with that the electrical exchange of the ions there on that scale. So now a little bit here, kind of snapshots over time. What we have the filling of the ventricles, we have the atrial contraction to support that filling. So one thing is passive. If you relax the muscle, it gets larger, then inflow comes, and if I compress the atria, that is supported, that filling of the ventricles. Then we have an isovolumetric contraction phase. That means the pressure is increasing, but the valves are still closed, and then the pressure inside the heart is stronger than the valves can bear, and then we have the ejection phase, then we have the relaxation and the filling again, and that goes on a cyclic base. we can bring things together. So what do we have? We have now a very stretched out ECG on the top row, and we have the ventricular volume at the bottom row here. That means how large is the filling when I monitor the heart. The important thing to keep in mind is that the heart is never empty. So we always have a residual volume in there. That residual volume can change according to the physical activity that we have, but we have it never empty. It's not squeeze it out to the very rest, but there's always something in here. And you can link that to the pressure inside the heart. This dichrotic notch is the point where the valves close, and as you see there's a slight increase in the pressure, and that helps us to push the blood into the coronaries that go around the heart. And the aorta has something which is called the Windkessel function. I think also in English, that's one of those few words that made it from German into English. That means the aorta is very flexible, and you store energy by pumping blood out of the heart. You make the volume, the diameter larger, and this is a kind of elastic, and then it decreases again and pumps the blood further down the vascular system. And you can put things all together here. We have heart sounds. Those heart sounds are turbulences that you can hear if you take a stethoscope. So in the ejection phase, it's not a laminar flow, so it's really something going on. There are turbulences there, and turbulences always come with some noise, and this noise is something you can listen. You see that this is closely after the QRS complex. That means as soon as the ventricles contract, if they are activated in the QRS complex, they contract, and then you have the ejection phase, and where it starts, there is a turbulence, and you get that sound. So this is now brought together. What I said previously in different slides for you, that you get those single things together, but I don't want to repeat it here. So the question now is, when do we need a cardiac pacemaker? As I already said, if the heart muscle is dead, it's too late. That means we need it when this activation system and the conduction system does not work for whatever reason. Yeah, so either the synchronicity is not there, or the synchronicity is there in the atrium and something has gone wrong and it is not transferred to the ventricles. That could be. Or the ventricles tend to do an independent rhythm from the atria. And so we really have to check what is there in the ECG, and then to find a solution. And this is really a success story. So it started in 1958, and the first implantable cardiac pacemaker was 1959. This is a portable one. Portable meant to those days you could carry it around. The first cardiac pacemakers, and I cannot remember if I have that slide. No, I don't have it here. The first ones were in a pushchair, because the batteries were so heavy that you need a kind of, imagine a pushchair for the elderly, such a walking frame, and you have a diesel battery in. And these were the times where the transistor was invented. So regular audio stuff, regular computers, Carl Zuse, Z1, were with tubes, not with transistors. And so it's really, wow. So this portable, and it's a transistor pacemaker. Yeah, there's probably one transistor in there. So really high end. And they had still percutaneous leads. So if you see old pictures, there are options that you get in a surgical intervention, the leads through the rib cage, and something was wrapped either around the heart from the outside, or those wires were poked in from the outside. And then cables came out of the body, and you were with your pushchair and your diesel battery there. And life expectancy was, of course, not that good. People came to the idea to make that implantable. October 3rd, 1959, Arne Larsen was the first one who got the first implantable cardiac pacemaker, and his first cardiac pacemaker lasted for 3 hours. So the second one did not work at all, so it was implanted 10 p.m., 3 a.m. next morning, again on the table. Next one didn't work, third one. And the good thing is he got, I think he was 40 something at that days. He died at the age of 81 or 86 or so. So he really was one of the pioneers and got 27 cardiac pacemakers over his lifetime. And there were a lot of things, and that was why I said this was a decision of life and death. A lot of things has been developed in those pioneering days where we all would go to jail immediately today. So they used, I don't know where they bought it, I'm pretty sure they bought it in a hardware store. They used epoxy to cover the transistor and the batteries and some things, and if you look that up, it's a famous story that the first cardiac pacemaker was molded in a box of shoe shine. You know, a tin can where you put that stuff in and then epoxy, stir it, wait for a day. And one of the most famous diseases after cardiac pacemaker implantation was then called cardiac pacemaker dermatitis. So that epoxy was not stable and there was some leaching of toxic agents and there was skin erosion here. So your skin was gone due to the toxic agents that came out of the cardiac pacemaker. And in those days, and nobody knew that to those days, you know. Probably our grandchildren will laugh at us when I say, well, what did they do? That's so obvious that you should not do that, but we don't know it today. So you have to take what you know from your state of the art. And one measure was to cover the whole cardiac pacemaker with a material that's called Parylene C. If you study microsystems engineering, or you might have heard that. It's a famous material that got approval within shortest time because there was a high need to put something non-toxic about that toxic stuff that nothing can leach out. And then cardiac pacemaker dermatitis never occurred again. And of course afterwards they found out probably it's more clever to use a titanium can that is more watertight than a pound of epoxy or something like that. But you can see the evolution of those cardiac pacemakers there and how they learned on that. Nowadays they are relatively small. We have more than 350,000 cardiac pacemakers being implanted per year worldwide. And they are really highly complex systems with a lot of microelectronics. Nevertheless, more than 2/3 of the volume of that cardiac pacemaker is still the battery. And the reason for that is that none of us likes to get reminded on a daily basis about his illness. And that means cardiac pacemakers are, a lot of persons find that really appealing, that you get the implantation, and then it lasts between 5 and 10 years. You have to go to the doctor once a year. Then the doctor has a device to check the battery life status, or you can have a mobile phone app and you can look, oh, my battery is still fine. So they have wireless links to mobile phones. Was the first hacking worldwide of medical devices in the US. Cardiac pacemakers got hacked some years ago, about 10, 15 years ago, that brought cybersecurity into medical device companies because it's really tough, you know. If you know the president of that country has a cardiac pacemaker, it's so you can affect your pacemaker. Either you're paying, you do this or that, you free those terrorists, or I push that button. So there's a huge need for security there. So that means we have a lot of electronics there, and my duty and my pleasure for today is to give you kind of idea what this electronics is good for. Because the first cardiac pacemaker had the basic functionality, delivering electrical pulses at a fixed frequency. We have to check now, well, what else do we need, or what could we do here. And I want to jump in a little bit from the reverse side to show you how it looks if you have a cardiac pacemaker. You have a cardiac pacemaker mainly here under the skin, the chest, and a cable goes through the vein. Very important, vein is low pressure system. Right? If you would have it in the artery, then you would have a hole in an artery at 120, if you have high blood pressure, probably 250 millimeter mercury. This is not a good idea for long-term run. Therefore, low pressure system, veins. And that brings us into the right atrium and into the right ventricle. But it's really hard to enter the left one because all the curvatures, if you would go back to the anatomy slides, you would see it's really tough to get in there. And that is one of the boundary conditions there. What we see here is that we have two electrical peaks that are somewhere. They come regularly, and the ECG look different, right? So this is here the replacement of the P wave, so the atrium, and this is a replacement of the activity in the ventricles. And if we now go to the ventricles, and I hope you can see that, it's down here in the right ventricle in the apex. If you would go back to the slide with the nerve conduction system, you would remember that was starting from the left ventricle up here and going downwards. So this is not the same, but it gives a good enough response. So we start here from that apex, and then the activity spreads over the muscles. That's good enough for ejection fraction of the heart. But since the activity, the electrical activity and the mechanical afterwards, is spread differently over the heart, all the superposition of the small tiny little bit of muscle cell activity over time and space looks differently here. So we have the wrong polarity here, and the shape is different, and it's wider than a regular QRS complex, and we have a different shape of the T wave with respect to the repolarization here. So this is how they look like. We have the stimulator and the battery, and you find that quite often under the abbreviation of IPG, implantable pulse generator. You need some connectors to connect the cables. You have cables with plugs that fit in there, and indeed there's a worldwide standard that you have the same plugs for the cables, and that you can buy the cardiac pacemaker. Not you, but you as medical doctor could buy the cardiac pacemaker from one company and the lead from another company, for example. And we have those electrode leads that go into the heart, and they have to get fixated. And for younger persons, looks like fishing rods here made of silicone rubber, and we have the contact here at the tip. And most of those electrodes are just one contact at the tip. That's beauty for the engineer, because you just need one cable with one lead. And doesn't matter if there's a short circuit between one turn or the other, because it's just one lead, one cable. If you would have two, then they have to be both coiled in parallel, and they should be insulated and stuff like that. And you quite often take the backside of that IPG as ground electrode. So in the heart versus ground. And the second one is one thing that goes, it's completely counterintuitive. If you learn something about biocompatibility, and Ali showed you some examples 2 weeks ago, this is completely counterintuitive because it's a corkscrew. It's a corkscrew, and you screw that into the cardiac tissue. That is the most widespread cardiac pacemaker electrode worldwide. And just from my knowledge, it could not work. It just does. Yeah, I would say it would not be fixed there. There would be foreign body reactions. There would be scarring. Whatever I've learned, I would project everything on that electrode. But it works. It perfectly works. It stays in place, and is against all textbook knowledge. But here still, I don't know. This looks like a bipolar one. So we have the corkscrew here. And we have a second ring electrode there, which much larger surface area, so you could have an electrical field in between those two contacts. Yeah?
How long is the corkscrew part?
2 millimeters, 3 millimeter. It's really corkscrew. So it's nothing miniaturized. It's really something that holds. I believe it's still used under X-ray imaging, so you can see where you go. Good contrast between that metal and the cardiac tissue, and it stays in there. The good thing of that concept is you place the electrode lead once, if everything runs well, and if your battery runs empty after 10 years, there are 2 screws there. You just open with a skin incision the place where it is, and you can palpate that, you can touch where it is. Take a screwdriver, open those 2 screws. Normally there's a fibrous tissue capsule around that. That means it's really clean inside there. You open the screws, you exchange the IPG with a new battery, put in your cables, fix them, and switch it on. The beauty of that battery thing is that the electronic has to last as long as the battery. And if the battery lasts 10 years, you can design your electronics such that it probably survives 11 years. That is completely different to a cochlear implant, where you implant it probably in a newborn with a life expectancy of 80 years, and you expect the electronics to work for 80 years. Right? So this is really one of the success stories here, and this probably contributes to that. Now we don't have to think too much about the longevity of the electronics, and we can design electronic devices that last for 10 years. I'm doubting a little bit if we are still at that point where we can design something that lasts for 100 years. Yeah?
I have a question to the electrode. So, the electrode or the heart muscle fiber or the tissue doesn't create like a foreign body reaction around the electrode. Is that because of the shape or the material?
The question is if it creates a foreign body reaction around the electrode. If we have that fishing rod structure, let's say, it's fixed in those fibers from the flaps, so there's no injury of the heart muscle, and we have for sure coverage with proteins, but the heart is beating and you have a kind of turbulent flow in the heart. And that would mean if you have something like a red blood cell coming and say, oh, I want to touch here, or a platelet, something like that, by the turbulent flow it's washed away again. So I think that is another point why this is successful. And the materials are polyurethane or silicone, rubber, stainless steel, some alloys, so steel with something in that make it more corrosive, resistant against corrosion. That's good enough. Okay. I don't say that it's the best ever possible, but it's, let's say, for 20, 30 years of working time, it's good enough.
If you're saying that the stainless steel is good enough to work like that in the side of the blood, because I mean, I remember that blood was really aggressive.
Yeah.
How does the stainless steel survive? And is there maybe like in ships, like another like lower like electronic?
No, it just does. So if you have it in medical grade, means good quality, less residues. So L316 is one of those stainless steels. You normally use, and this goes a little bit beyond that lecture, but because you're asking, you go towards MP35M, That's a very famous alloy with chromium, cobalt, a little bit of mangan in there, which is very corrosive resistance. So you can, and you use it in a way that the level of voltage that you use or the current that is passed is very much in a very safe range of the material, and then it stays there. I don't say that it does not corrode, but it survives the life expectancy of 20 years or something like that. I'm pretty sure you will see signs of corrosion. This is what people now see in the oldest cochlear implants that get now explanted after 20 years or something like that. There's serious corrosion that you can see on platinum. Alternative is to use platinum iridium as alloy, platinum for the charge delivery, iridium to put on some mechanical strength. That can be used. There are some approaches where carbon is used as surface coverage to have anti-pyrogenic properties. Some cardiac pacemaker companies used titanium nitride as very corrosive resistant surface coverage for the electrodes, or iridium oxide. So there's a certain spread there. Yeah?
What type of batteries are
Good question. I'm not the battery guy, so there's certain safety requirements for medical grade batteries. So they're mainly based on lithium, if I'm correct, and they have to be explosive. They're a certain safety range that they don't explode. And these requirements are so high that there is a whole industry on medical grade batteries. Not many companies, but 2 or 3 worldwide, who then deliver those things that meet the standards, that they don't get too warm, that they don't explode, that whatever. There's a double layer of insulation around or something like that. So to get into kind of understanding of the cardiac pacemakers, there's a worldwide code there with 5 digits, and that's good to learn because one question always goes on that code in the exam. And the first letter gives you the answer on the question which chambers are paced. So it can be either the atrium or the ventricle or both, and both is dual, yeah, or none. Well, a cardiac pacemaker that does not stimulate is probably nonsense, but the code gives also the option that you say, no, I have a cardiac pacemaker that does not stimulate. I have no idea. Then I would call that a recorder and not a stimulator. Then you have the second digit, which gives you the answer to the question, do I have sensing? And that is either ventricle, atrium, or both. Or you can decide on your own. Single means it's not predetermined. So if an S is there, means yes, I have one channel to sense, and please, doctor, do what you like to do with that. Yeah. Third one is the response to sensing. What do I do if I sense something? Do I do nothing? Do I inhibit stimulation, or do I trigger that? And you can imagine 2 cases. One case is that stimulator stimulates all the time, and if it detects something, it does not stimulate because the heart is then working. Or you say, oh, I first like to listen, and if I don't hear anything, then I stimulate. If I hear something, I don't stimulate. The effect is similar at the end, but the approach is just the opposite there. Or you can program that. You can say, okay, I don't want to decide in advance, I want to have both, and you need probably another microcontroller or 2 lines more of code in the microcontroller to get that. Then it's about programmability or rate modulation. So can I change the frequency? And they started early with that code because the P means I have 2 functions. So I can switch between 2 frequencies. That's probably no longer state of the art. M means I have more functions. C means I have telemetric data exchange, and R means I can adapt the rate according to the activity. This is here, the R is the state-of-the-art letter. And then it's about the anti-arrhythmia function that is called an implantable defibrillator. So a lot of persons tend to have fibrillation of the heart, so uncoordinated activity of the muscle cells, either in the atrium or in the ventricle. And the measure to stop that is to give an electric shock. And either the heart beats again afterwards, or you have that trigger function of your cardiac pacemaker. So in that case, you need more juice, so larger battery capacity that you can switch between regular triggering and a shock of the whole heart. And that means the cardiac pacemaker gets larger and thicker and more bulky because of a larger battery. And the lifetime gets shorter the more electrical shocks you need. That means you cannot predict in such a device it lasts for 10 years because you do not know if you need a shock every 5 years or if you need a shock twice a day. Yeah, so therefore it's difficult with the prediction. Now, the main topic of today, and I'm already running out of time, but I think it's important to give you all that stuff around, then it's easier to understand the senses, is the question, why do I need something? And this is, it comes to a wild mixture of German and English, because my favorite graphs are in German textbook, and my dear colleague did not publish over 50 years of career in English. No idea why not. So we have the heart, we have the pacemaker, and the heart gives either signals to the pacemaker or the pacemaker stimulates the heart. And then we have some sensors which should help. We have an external programmer for the pacemaker, and of course there are some disturbances. And these disturbances could, for example, be you're sitting at rest in a car and driving a bumpy road. Then it could be that the cardiac pacemaker detects activity, even though you're sitting still. And we have to deal with those disturbances, because you don't want to get a heartbeat of 200 just because you're driving a bumpy road. Yeah, so tricky stuff. And to understand what we can do, we should look first into the details what our heart does. I always use that example of increased heartbeat frequency. That is called the chronotropy. That means that it's a frequency, it's a kind of open loop control. Our autonomous nervous system gives input somewhere to increase frequency, by those slope of the spontaneous depolarization, for example. But we have other mechanisms. That's first of all the inotropy. That's the strength of contraction. So how much do I contract? How much ejection fraction do I get? And if you look in physiology textbooks when it comes to sports persons or something like that, or your activity, you will find out that there's that at increased activity at a certain level we have increased ejection fraction. So the heart contracts stronger, not only faster at a faster frequency, but also stronger. So our residual volume gets less in the heart. And that means we have more flow, or faster flow in the system, to have faster exchange, delivery of oxygen, faster back transport of carbon dioxide. And the third one is the dromotropy. That is the conduction velocity over the AV node. And my picture of that is that the coordination between the atrium and the ventricles gets faster. You know, if you would have that as an engine, you would say the pumps interact faster with each other. I remember that as probably a completely weird example. I remember that from old cars and motorcycles, combustion engines. where you could, and old means before 1950, where you had for those a lever where you could modulate the point of ignition. So if it's a bit faster or a bit later, to get different range of torque during combustion. And I find that similar here, that we have that coordination between atria and ventricles gets closer together if we are at higher power output. And the question is, can we create sensors that measure that part of the story to get this effect integrated into a cardiac pacemaker? Frequency is easy. The faster you stimulate, the faster the heartbeat. But what about the ejection fraction, and what about that coordination? Coordination is something I would say, well, if I have a two-chamber pacemaker, atria, ventricles, I just have to align them. But the question is, how do I measure that there is a need of that dromotropy? And how do I measure how much I eject something? Yeah? So first of all, if you want to bring that, if you want to impress persons, you can use that slide here. So that means it's not just the frequency and the activity as such, it's a lot of stuff here. We have the question about how does oxygen saturation influence these whole mechanisms. Where? Is it in the blood, in the tissue? Is it in the lung, in the blood? How do brainstem networks influence based of that knowledge? This blood oxygen saturation is the control mechanisms are in the brainstem. How does that influence the brainstem over the autonomic nervous system, that whole story? What about atrial contraction, ventricular contraction, the excitations there? What does the autonomic nervous syndrome does, and a lot of stuff. To cut that short, main stuff is here the sick sign syndrome. Means we have the sinus node, and the sinus node is no longer able to adapt its frequency to our activity. That means the heart's beating at 60 while we would need 120. And this is then where a cardiac pacemaker should come in with frequency adaptation, and this is that sick sign syndrome. So we have the activity, and activity could be, what are we doing? You know that all from your smartphone apps. You know that you've done your 10,000 steps today, so they monitor something. That is now much easier with all the microsystems that we have, that we could use that, for example, in the cardiac pacemaker. If I walk, this device monitors that and adapts the frequency. This, of course, then a little bit patient specific, that we have to check out what does this particular patient need as increase or decrease. I'll show you something. And then we can have other activity. Could be the breathing volume. If you breathe deeper, you would need more, and then you can shift that. And breathing means you see that, you get that for free as artifact. So normally it's something you don't want to see in a cardiac system, but if I record from here to here the heart activity and I breathe, I have more air in, and air has a different electrical resistance than the tissue. So if I have more, I see that as a change in the potential that I get. And with some algorithms and a microcontroller, I could say, well, heartbeat is between, let's say, 50 or 40 something if you're a sports person, and 200 if you're no sports person. And you breathe between 8 times per minute to 30 times per minute or something like that. So you can set a filter there that you get those slow signals separated from the faster ones, for example. Or blood temperature. That is then, if it comes to fever normally also increases the heart rate. So if you have fever, heart beats faster, something like that. And the idea is to get as much out of those secondary parameters that you can put into algorithms to adapt your heartbeat. And then it comes to research, where people say, well, I can monitor the atrioventricular conduction time and see what the system behind already does, and I can adapt the stimulation to that. And the QT interval, so QRS-T, so that interval, if you measure that, that is one of the indicators for psychological load. So if you measure that, you get an idea if you should tweak a little bit on the frequency there. Of course, it would be nice to see how the muscle contract, so how the pressure changes over time. That will mean you have to put something into the ventricle to measure that. And I'll show you some ideas that person had. One could be a pressure transducer, which is not bad, but you need at least 2 additional cables, probably more, because you need voltage and ground and signal. You have to modulate things on top of that. Or you measure the curvature. Could be done with an optical fiber. If you bend an optical fiber, light goes out, and the more light goes out, the more it is bent. So you could do that on an optic way, and you could measure the acceleration of the heart that you put an accelerometer directly inside the electrode. At the end, it turned out that's all. You put an accelerometer into the IPG and do a little bit of signal processing of the ECG, and that's good enough. All the other stuff is too complex to have a good risk-benefit ratio there. So it does not bring that much for the patient. It would cost much more, and then it's always a cost issue if you put something in that does not give you really additional benefit on that. Good. So, chronotropic pacemaker, in most cases, either sick sign syndrome, so the sinus node does not adapt, or there is a blockade in between the atrium and the ventricle on the AV node. AV stands for atrioventricular node. And then you need a pacemaker either in the atrium for the sick sign syndrome or in the ventricle if you have an AV conduction block. And this is more here historical stuff. Either you can measure this acceleration with an accelerometer, so what we all have in our smartphones, or old style with a piezoelectrical transducer. Means if you move something, then the inertia somehow is against movement, and that changes the thickness of such a transducer, and you get a signal that you can use. This means we have a kind of open loop control here. We detect something and we believe we should act on that and increase or decrease the frequency. We have no idea about the real hemodynamic need. So we just see activity has to lead to an increase in frequency, but we cannot measure if this is really in the right order with respect to the need of oxygen. And we have no adaptation to mental load, like falling in love, being afraid of an exam, something like that, or to fever. We have to suppress those unrelated physical activity. Always good to have a second opinion by a second measurement to be on the safe side there. It's already said. Here some more research things that never made it to the market. Good ideas, but for certain reasons in translational research, too expensive. Idea not at the right level of the technology readiness level, so sometimes ideas come too early. And then people say, we cannot do that with that technology, and what keeps in mind for everybody is it doesn't work. Yeah, and it does not mean that it doesn't work, but it did not work to that point in time. And there are other things that will never fly because the principle does not work. It's sometimes hard to sort that out over the times and the technologies that are available. Here it would have been an accelerometer in the tip of a cardiac pacemaker. That would be awesome. You know, you can directly measure what is going on in the heart, but you would need more cables to the back end. And more cables means more complex cable winding, higher price, and less robustness. Because you need, in this case, at least 4 cables that are insulated against each other, while the simple ones is 1 cable, no insulation. So that's one thing here. Why that doesn't fly. We have those MEMS accelerometers, and that was really the breakthrough. They're small, they're cheap, you can buy them. Milli-G means here 1/1000th of the Earth acceleration can be measured. We have 1% non-linearity, that's nearly nothing. That's, for me, it's more than linear. And it's really small. So you can place that on electronic board in a cardiac pacemaker, and it doesn't increase the size of the whole package. To bring you results from early studies, of course, I could have taken a study from 2021, which shows that everything is ideal, but I'm a strong believer that it's good to go back to early studies to see what people found out in the very beginning, before everybody was convinced that you need that. Those persons, if you have to convince others, you take more care of designing your studies or phrasing your arguments there. And then was here piezo and accelerometer with the QT interval and the minute ventilation. That is the impedance while breathing. And if you do that, and these were certain cardiac pacemakers where at least those 2 are no longer present on the market. There was every 5 or 10 years there's a huge I buy you, you buy me. We call our name is now completely different. At the very end, it's always a turnover of the same 5 companies that then decide, I'll do this one, I buy that one, I sell you this one, and at the end things stay the same. So the good thing is the combination here of acceleration and minute volume, or piezo and QT, that you could have best cross-check and best interaction between both. But of course there's no information about sensors, and that's quite often a pity if you have those clinical trials. The companies do not disclose to the general public what's in there. They just disclose how good they are. And if they meet the endpoints mean I define something I want to reach, and if I meet that, I can pass the approval procedure. And then my device is approved and I can sell it. And this gets published because this convinces then all the potential customers. All the doctors say, hey, that's so cool, I want to use your cardiac pacemaker for my patients. Right? So, but the company doesn't tell us here. Pin 3 is ground and pin 4 is 5 volts, and we have a 2 kilo ohm resistor here or something like that. If we compare those things, the QT interval has a high specificity, so that means if something can be seen there, it's something you can rely on. It changes also during recovery. I mean, you know that all. If you run up a staircase and you're up there, you're there, you stand, but you still breathe heavily. And if the cardiac pacemaker says, "Pop, no activity," switch down to 45 per minute. Immediately, that could be a problem, right? So therefore, it's very important to have that recovery phase thing in here, where you can still be at a higher level and sneak out after some time. And it's responsive to mental stress. I mean, whenever you have mental stress, that could be seen in the QT interval, and you could adapt that for that load. Of course, there's nothing for free. It's slow in reactivity. There could be overpacing during recovery phase. The T wave is a tricky thing. There could be some misinterpretation there, and it's affected also by drugs and electrolyte imbalance. And the QT interval is now one of the indicators in drug development, for example. So it has been shown that an elevation in the QT interval is a very good indicator that you might have side effects on the heart of drugs. Might it be against headache, to reduce the fever, whatever. No matter what a medication is good for, it has to be accompanied with a thorough ECG analysis, and as soon as you see a QT level elevation, it's out. So therefore, this means it's good that you see something, but those changes are of course not related to your cardiac pacing, but something different, but could be change the interpretation there. And of course, it only works, the QT interval, if you measure the QT interval, and you can measure that inside the heart only in the ventricles, since it's about repolarization of the ventricles. If you have an atrial pacemaker only, it doesn't work because you don't get the signals there from the atrium as clear as needed. Minute ventilation is also slow. Is of course less reliable in pulmonary diseases because pulmonary diseases could somehow, the effects of those diseases superimpose what you want to measure. And you need a bipolar lead. That was probably a detail of that study here. The activity sensors, the accelerometers, they are fast, but they have no specificity. They don't know why they detect movement. They just detect movement, right? But they are simple, they're fast. Unfortunately, they're inactive during recovery. They don't give us anything there. Therefore, this combination of two, one which needs an additional sensor, accelerometer, and the other one where you have to get your signal for free out of what you already record, is something that has good success. Yeah, artifact reduction is something you should do. Is there activity? Is there no activity? What do I do when I detect something there? And in that very early study, there was then the assessment of the strategies. What strategies do they have? The different approaches. What can I do? Is there a side effect that is unwanted? And this is something what you have to check and to, I think now 20 years later, a lot of things have changed. Microprocessors are much more powerful. You can implement many more algorithms. And this was done here really on a study where you get an implant, you get to the doctor, you do the study there, the doctor fills in a questionnaire, tick, 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 all analog based, and you make an assessment there. Nowadays, nearly every cardiac pacemaker have a telemetric link and have a memory in there, so you can record, for example, depending on the strategy, the last 3 minutes, always in a ring buffer, or you record and then you store certain parameters that you need and can read them out on a regular basis. That means you can do much more and get more data, and this is now also business strategy in many companies, that they don't earn money by having awesome devices, but by processing data. I mean, all that artificial intelligence, machine learning, all those buzzwords you hear everywhere are now used to collect patient data and to try to find something out there. And by having so many data, you might get better access to orphan diseases, so to something that is really rare, which you do not detect because you don't find the persons. But if you record all the data, probably find out, look, if I see this somewhere here, and something happens 1 year later there could be a correlation. Causality is, of course, something different, but you can find out certain things. And this is now the latest business concept of the big medical device companies, that they do data crunching and promise a lot of things, and we have to see the next years what comes out and what's the truth and what not. Here's some data from this old study here. So detecting activity and then finding out which increase of stimulation frequency does the patient need and does the patient tolerate. And this is then a kind of adjusting control mechanisms by hand to see if patient, that was too much, I feel so nervous. Then they say, okay, then we decrease that upper level a little bit, or decrease the slope, or increase the slope in a way that patients feel well adjusted there. With that, I like to come to an end for today. This is the literature where I stole all the slides. And here are the take-home messages. So, very important, cardiac pacemakers substitute the electrical pacemaker function of the sinoatrial node and the AV node, but they do not replace contraction. The heart must be strong enough to contract by itself. Integrated sensors can detect activity and adjust the heart rate. And acceleration sensors in combination with a second sensor node, like that QT interval or minute ventilation, deliver reliable signals where you can blank out artifacts and get also information about mental load. Still, 20 years after those books appeared, there's still a lot of research going on. I'm not aware that there are clinical products around with inotropic or dromotropic pacemaker control. And one of the reasons could be that the frequency control, the chronotropic, is good enough. Yeah, and good enough is a good way for medical devices. I mean, if it's good enough and your quality of life is high enough with that, why should you spend another 50,000 just to get another 1% or something like that? Yeah, with that, I'm at the very end. Thank you very much. Wish you a good start into that week after your break. Hope we see you on Wednesday or next Monday or whenever. Thank you very much.